Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SavvyCast. This is Jamie, and whether you are watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast, I am very grateful that you're tuning into the SavvyCast. I have a very special guest today, Chris Bailey. Chris has been my producer since the inception of the SavvyCast, and the SavvyCast would not exist were it not for Chris. He got me started. He does a lot of my editing along with one other producer, and I am just so grateful for him. I consider him a dear friend and a very integral part of all things Family Savvy. Chris, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Jamie. The feeling is definitely mutual. It has been such a blessing to be a part of the SavvyCast and watch it grow from its inception to where it is now. It's definitely a little bit weird being in front of the microphone and in front of like the camera. As opposed to, editing it and being behind it. So I'm excited for today's discussion.
Well, okay. Well, Chris, let's just dive into our topic. And for those of you watching or listening, Chris is going to basically share his personal testimony. And I think he's going to cover a lot of things that will be very helpful and insightful to everyone, and it might be especially helpful for those of you who might have certain struggles with mental illness. So, Chris, what would be your last meal?
Gosh, that's such a difficult question for me because I love so many different types of food. I definitely know one of the things that would be on there is a dessert, and it is my mother makes this chocolate cake that's actually her grandmother's recipe. So this would be my great-grandmother's chocolate recipe. Mm-hmm. It's a very simple recipe, but the frosting is basically like fudge. It is like the most moist, delicious, decadent cake, and it is super easy to make. That definitely would be there. Honestly, I think the rest of the meal could be anything else as long as I have that as a closer. That would be the perfect way to wrap up that meal.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, I'm going to ask Suzanne if she'll give me that recipe.
Yes.
If it's not.
It's very simple. I will say one thing, too, a lot of butter, which, of course, as we know.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
It just makes it so much better.
That's true. And on that note, before we dive into Chris's story, his precious, beautiful mom, Suzanne, was on a previous podcast, and it has been extremely well received and downloaded. And it is on her struggle with lupus and fibromyalgia and how she manages to live a full, exuberant life with those. So if that is something that interests you, you can scroll back in the archives, and I will actually link to that in the show notes. But everything that Chris and I discussed today will be in the show notes. But Chris, again, just start by telling us about yourself.
Yeah, and I kind of want to preface everything, too, with something we were talking about before we started the episode about people coming forward and discussing mental illness and mental health. I definitely think as we move into and hopefully move out of COVID, quarantine, isolation, we're seeing another resurgence, and it's all, the world's crazy right now. And I think now more than ever is a vital time to be discussing mental well-being just as a whole. And for anybody out there that feels like they're struggling, I definitely want to say, I know it's cliche to say it, but you're not alone. But also, you really don't need to feel like you have to hide your mental illness or those struggles. You have every right to keep them private if you want to, but don't feel like you're confined to it. I think that's what gives mental illness so much of its power, is the ability of, this isn't normal. You need to keep this to yourself. What will others think of this? If you can begin to work on that mindset and begin to desire to have the ability to share it with others, I think that in and of itself takes a lot of the sting out of mental illness, because then you don't feel like you have to isolate. You can actually step into these communities and start finding like-minded individuals, some of whom never would have expected to be dealing with these things. It's so beneficial if you could begin to step into that. So a little preface before we get started there.
Yes. Well, so Chris, you are in my view, as a 56-year-old, you're a young, vibrant, young professional.
Yeah.
So just tell us just a little bit about how you landed as a very successful producer, and you work for yourself. You're your own business.
Yeah.
CSB Productions. This is what you do. So, can you tell us just briefly how you got here?
I mean, I started in my undergrad at Samford University. Got actually, that's my master's right there, but started in journalism and mass communication. Thought I wanted to be a broadcaster, thought I wanted to be an on-air personality, something like "You're watching the 5 o'clock news at 6," something goofy like that. But realized that really is a difficult career path to take. But I always loved sharing others' stories, being able to tell my own story, but help others share their stories to the best of their abilities. And I got started with a few other clients, and I was just enthralled with being able to take this raw, unedited conversation and tweak it up a little bit and release it to where people were like, wow, that really resonated with me. And so I ended up going back, getting my master's, just because I thought a master's in business administration would be beneficial. I honestly did not have the mindset of starting my own company when I graduated. I thought I was going to be able to cruise right in, get a corporate job, start working for somebody there and helping that corporation to share its story. And a lot of places were like, we're very impressed with your academics, but you really don't have the experience. And so there was a lot of thought that went into that, where I'm like, do I want to keep trying to look for a corporate job, or do I take these clients I currently have and just go ahead and do this for myself? And the Lord really laid on my heart. He basically said, just go for it. And so we conceptualized CSB Productions, and it has been nothing but a blessing since. I've got a little bit of memorabilia on the wall there, but probably one of the biggest clients I've gotten to work with is Pokemon. You may know that from your children loving the little adorable creatures, but I got to work on them with a documentary as well as a commercial. And that's something that if you had told me when I started this company 2.5 years ago that would have happened, I would have looked at you like, I mean, that sounds amazing, but that seems pretty far-fetched. Like it's been incredible how far we've come in 2 years. But yeah, that's a little bit on how I got started. I can pivot a little bit into more of my personal life. I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina. We ended up moving here to Birmingham when I was 8. And the reason I bring that up is because it actually kind of perfectly sets the stage for not where everything went wrong, but where things started to get put into place in terms of my upcoming struggles and battles. Because
was at the age of 8.
It was.
So you have a clear memory, and there's a starting point. And okay, so that's very interesting that you have that marker.
Yeah, some people may not have a clear marker, but for me, and if my mom and dad are listening to this, they know exactly what I'm going to bring up. But I was incredibly close to my dad's dad, my grandpa. I considered him my best friend. He was a very heavy smoker. He smoked from the age of 12 until the time that he ultimately passed. He barely made it to 60.
Did he die of lung cancer?
It was, by the time they found the lung cancer, it was stage 4. It hit fast, it hit hard, and he was a fighter. But I mean, we just kind of, I didn't, because I was actually 6 when he passed. But that was just the sort of thing that, it's difficult to come back to, because I believe this was early 2000. He passed in 2001. So the technology wasn't there either for cancer treatments, but I was just pretty devastated. I apparently had a great moment at his funeral where everybody was speaking. And at 6, I told my dad, I want to speak. And they're like, no, sweetheart, I don't think you understand. And I'm like, no, I want to speak. And so my dad held me up. He's literally holding me up by my arms. And I literally started off by saying, I didn't say grandpa, I said, Sam was my best friend. And my dad said, everybody just started tearing up.
Wow.
It was hilarious, because he said, man, how in the world do I follow that when my son's just told this beautiful speech? I have to follow that up. And so that was definitely, I have a smile on my face now, just because that's such a warm memory for me in terms of where I am now. And again, as we discuss more, you may be thinking, how do you have a warm memory of your grandfather's funeral? We'll get to that.
Yeah.
But about 6 to 9 months later, I don't really remember the exact time frame of this, but my father got a job opportunity with Regions to be basically one of the pioneers in their environmental risk management board, because that's what he does. So pretty much immediately after my grandfather died, my dad kind of comes in and says, we're uprooting everything and moving to Birmingham, Alabama. And you combine two of those back to back in the span of like less than a year. And even as a child, it hits really hard because not only are you trying to recognize the concept of death in general, you're also completely moving away from everything that you've grown up with.
You were in second grade, is that right?
Yeah, I was in second grade when we moved here. And it was like, I was already kind of struggling a bit in school, not academically, but socially. And from there, I would end up going to 3 different elementary schools in the span of 3 years. Because
in Birmingham?
At every one of those schools, I still had problems with bullying. A lot of people, the thing that I find funny today is that it's almost cool to be a nerd. But back in the day, that was still something that might be a bit more mocked or ridiculed. So it really was like in the span of a few years, we had the death of my grandfather, moving away and losing all my friends in Charlotte to move to Birmingham, then going to 3 different schools and not really fitting in anywhere there. And so it was just kind of rapid fire, all of these different trials before I even was really a teenager.
Well, and I know that this is a whole nother podcast, but you also have diabetes, and that in itself is enough to cause so much mentally in addition to physically. But were you diabetic at 8, or was that a little later?
That's kind of the funny thing is as I began to settle into Briarwood, I was diagnosed in 8th grade. I was 13 years old. And so that was kind of, again, it began to demonstrate this mindset. My parents always raised me with, whenever life knocks you down, you get back up and you keep pushing forward. But I started to develop this mindset of, man, every single time I get back up, it seems like life, it isn't just ready with the punch. It's got the knockout Mike Tyson, send you out of the ring punch. I'm like, good night. Like it was always something. And that began to really develop a negative mindset, not just of others, but really of myself. Because after a while, after going to all these different schools, and each time my parents would say, this will be a fresh start, and it always seemed to turn out in a similar way, my brain was like, maybe it's not the other people, but maybe it's me. Maybe I'm the problem here, because surely all of these other people can't be rude or disrespectful. It's got to be something that I'm doing. It's got to be something that is inherently wrong with myself. And so I'm not saying this is how everybody experiences, self-deprecation, depression, anxiety, but I pretty much had the full gambit of that by the time I reached high school, which is normally where, if you think about it, people will start to exhibit symptoms of that. I was already there.
Were you exhibiting? Okay, so you were 8 going on 9. Were you diagnosed at that age with mental illness, or was your mom just concerned, and your dad of how do you know that it started then?
Just because I know with my own thought process, I know that that's where it originated. My mom could definitely see a difference. I mean, especially when you have situations where you have an 8 or a 9-year-old saying, I don't like myself. That's typically where you've got an issue. It's just the sort of thing that, again, I think I didn't get really a formal diagnosis until after I was diagnosed with my diabetes, but it was definitely present after we had moved from Charlotte to Birmingham. Just those 2 quick events from the time I was 6 to 8 were really kind of the tipping point, I guess you could say, that led me into this more negative mindset, negative thought pattern. And really from there, it just continued. I went all the way through high school, and I had some really good moments, but in my mind, they were a little bit few and far between. There were a lot of bad moments. I graduated, went to Samford. I'm like, all right, college, fresh start. It's exactly the same. Dang it. It's like, I'm looking around like every time I seemed like I'd have a fresh start, it almost was like I was setting myself up in a sense, but also it seemed like there were factors out of my control that I just thought would go better. And ultimately, that led me to just be in a really depressive state for the better part of a decade. I would be, if I'm entirely honest. There were definitely days where I was happy that I was loving life, but there were definitely also other days that I was on the opposite end of the spectrum. And it was the sort of thing that after a while, I almost started to find comfort in those moments of depression and anxiety. Because at the end of the day, what I realized was every time I would try something, or every time I would go to a new place, or maybe try something new, try branching out to someone, in my mind, it always seemed to go wrong. But it was unexpected as well. And that made the shock even worse. Well, with my depression and my anxiety, it's known. I know exactly how I'm going to feel for how long. And yeah, I know where it's going to come from. And so that almost became like a blanket to wrap myself in because yes, it may stink, but I know exactly what I'm getting into. I don't have to face any uncertainty with this mental illness as opposed to, oh gosh, I could in college, for example, I could get dressed up and try to go out and talk to some people on the quad and, maybe make new friends, but that comes with risk. And risk was like the big issue in my mind. I became a very risk averse person because sure, it could go great, but it could also go so much worse. And I would then begin thinking to myself, why didn't I just stay in my dorm room? Why didn't I just stay in bed? And so I think that's where sometimes, I don't want to speak for everybody that has mental illness, but a lot of people can find themselves in that place, particularly after these traumatic events. You can begin to almost find solace, even if you're still miserable. Like, I don't think there's anybody over there like, yes, I feel terrible, and they've got a smile on their face. But when they're in those moments, they still can find a bit of comfort because they're certain. There are things that they can control.
Well, Chris, you sound like you're saying it was primarily depression, maybe with laced with some anxiety. How do you describe depression? What does it feel like? How does it manifest?
I definitely think the best way I could describe it would be take a moment where you're in grief, but take it from the perspective of whether it's a death in the family or a really tragic diagnosis, that sinking feeling, that feeling where it's not just you're upset or grieving, but you're drained. Like you feel like you've run a marathon and you haven't even taken a step. And then take that other moment of grief and just a little bit of stress, kind of ball that up together. And I would say that's kind of the base of what depression feels like. And I think, again, it's different for everybody, but in mine, it was also as if I had this little tiny me on my shoulder who was always just chirping insecurities into my ear. Just saying.
So you had the voice in your ear speaking negative talk.
Oh, yes. And it wasn't just like, oh, man, you don't really look that good today. It was borderline, the end result of severe depression. I don't like to use the term because I know it could be very traumatic for some people, but it was that type of talk. And so, again, it really does affect everyone differently. And the way that I would say depression overall works is it's not like you're just sitting there working on something and bam, it hits you out of nowhere and you're suddenly depressed. It's almost like a wave. You'll have periods where it elevates and then you'll have periods where it goes back down. It's almost like the waves or the tide. It recedes and then it goes back out and it recedes, it goes back out. That's the best way I can describe something like a depressive state. And
were you, Chris, were you on medication? At what point did you start medication?
Oh, gosh. I believe I started in high school. I believe I was probably in 9th or 10th grade. I'm sure my mother can correct me on this because she's got the photographic memory in that regard. But I want to say it was 9th or 10th grade. So it was a little while before I really was able to get on that medication. I've kind of run the gambit of those medications because part of the things that you have to do if you are going to get on a medication is you've got to be willing to try a few because there's, again, not one size fits all for it. But with SSRIs in particular for depression, and even something like Xanax, which is considered much stronger for anxiety, they're meant to take the edge off of whatever it is that you're experiencing. They are not meant to be a cure for depression or anxiety or whatever. They just take off the sharpest point of that edge so it feels a little bit more tolerable. Like I will still have depressive episodes to this day, even though I would say I'm in a much better place than I was even my senior year in college. There are still days where I'll have it, But with things like the Zoloft, it just helps to take that edge off. So I'm not completely overwhelmed when those episodes arise.
So you have the SSRI to take the edge off, but the episodes still can come unexpectedly or possibly even exacerbate or initiated by an incident. Chris, is there any, do you have a continual visit with a therapist or a psychiatrist, psychologist? I mean, there's so many different people that treat different aspects of that.
Right.
What's your regimen?
I mean, I'm not really as active with my therapist anymore, primarily because he is absolutely amazing. I'll just go ahead and give him a shout out. It's Trey at Covenant Counseling. He is incredible, but he books up like 4 months in advance because he's just that one-on-one, that empathetic. He understood me from the moment I came in. I believe I started seeing him probably at 14 or 15. So with these episodes, when they continue to come on, there is kind of a checklist that I like to go down in addition to just popping a pill and hoping that that works. Therapy is definitely something that is incredibly transformational, especially cognitive behavioral therapy for things like depression or repeated negative thinking. It really works wonders. But my biggest recommendation would be find a therapist that you really resonate with. Don't be afraid to shop around. It may be a bit of an investment, and that's something I'd love to argue for, is to have therapy visits covered by insurance, but that's a topic for another day. But really don't be afraid to look around to find a therapist that you can resonate with, because if you find someone that you can really trust in sharing even the deepest, darkest moments of your struggles, you will see so much results from that, because the therapist is really going to be able to dive into the root of the issue. In my case, it is a fear of change and a desire to have control over things that are out of my control. Those were two of the big ones for me. And Trey was
those are two things that are basically guaranteed in life for all of us. I mean,
exactly.
Really, we're going to have change. One thing that's certain is that things are going to change, and that we are really not in control, even though we think we're in control of a few things, but not a whole lot.
But I mean, I can't control whether or not somebody likes me. That's an aspect of something out of my control. I could be the nicest person on earth, and someone still may decide that I just really don't like your personality, and that's completely out of my control. So all that to say, though, if you can be able to open up to your therapist and not just be like, so how are you feeling? I'm feeling good. You just kind of nod your head through the therapy visit just so you can say, okay, I went to therapy this week, and check off the box. If you can really have that open, deep conversation with them, that is going to mean a world of difference. And what I think a lot of people have to recognize is, with these deep-rooted traumas, regardless of what it is that you've gone through, there is going to be some pain in working through those issues, in both bringing them up to the surface. If you've done like I did, I tried to shove those issues as deep inside of my spirit as I could. I didn't want anybody knowing that they happened. I didn't want anybody knowing that I had problems. I just stuffed it all down. Of course, you know what happens. It's like trying to keep a beach ball under the water. You push down hard, and then it just pops right up, and if you're lucky, it'll smack you right upside the face. But if you're willing to begin that process, it doesn't have to happen overnight, but being able to bring those things to the surface so you can then begin to pull them away.
And Chris, I know, okay, so you said, of course, you have the medication.
Yes.
And then the therapy that help. What are other practical things that have helped you? Are there books? Are there support groups? Are there, any resources that you have found useful?
All of the above. One of the things that my mother actually taught me was to begin speaking life over myself. And I thought that was the dumbest thing when I was a teenager, because I thought I knew everything. But when you have the negative talk of no one cares, you're not worth it, give up. You play that enough times in your head. I don't care how happy of a person you are, you're going to be miserable. Exactly. Yes. So you begin to say the exact opposite as those thoughts begin to come into your head. And the first dozen times I did them, I'll tell you, I felt like the dumbest person out there, because I'm sitting in my apartment saying, I am loved, I am special. The first few times you say that, you feel like this is never going to work. Why am I doing this? But that is literally your own negative thinking trying to stop you from doing it. Because exactly as you said, you continue to speak life over yourself, you'll start to see some results.
Oh, well, in the verse in scripture, life and death are in the power of the tongue.
Yep.
And that's, and speaking life, I mean, that to me is one of the most powerful truths. Our words, they manifest. They bring about either good or evil, love or hate. Words, I think one of the most ridiculous untruths that's like a little idiom is sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. There's nothing farther from the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Not only others' words, but our own words. And bless your mother for realizing that. I mean, even things, the power of positive thinking and all. So what particular, because you mentioned to me like a few days ago, a book that your mom.
So the book that my mother actually gave me, it's called, and this may be backwards, but Don't Give the Enemy a Seat at Your Table by
Louis Giglio. He's fabulous. I love him.
I love the tagline for this. It's time to win the battle of your mind. And it talks about how a lot of this negative talk is the enemy trying to get a seat at your table. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I want to explain too is, even if there's listeners out there that would say, well, I'm not very religious, I don't really believe in any of that sort of stuff, I would still give this book a read, because there is so much to take away from it in terms of how you cannot give this negative voice, whether you want to call it the enemy, whether you want to call it your evil twin, whatever you want to call the negative voice in your mind. It's resources like this that can help you begin to change that pattern of thinking. It's almost like another offshoot of cognitive behavioral therapy, where you can really retrain the way that your brain thinks, so that you don't have to continually stick to these cycles that are just going to keep pushing you down further and further and further.
And Chris, let me clarify, and I know some of this because I have a master's in biblical counseling, but I never did my hours. I never took that to the end. So I could not technically go out and get a job because I didn't do all my internship, but I did take all the courses.
Yeah.
And as I recall, cognitive behavioral therapy, that is when you're basically retraining your brain and the neural pathways, because after we repeat things or habits or words, we have actual neural pathways in our brains that can actually be reprogrammed. So is that what you're saying you did?
Yes, I did a bit of that myself, and I found it very beneficial. But you're exactly right. After you've driven a car enough times, what happens when you have to go somewhere? It's automatic. You get in, you know exactly how to put the key in your car, start it up, turn on the radio to your favorite station, and drive. It becomes second nature. It's the exact same thing with our thought process. After a while of being in a cycle of either holding on to something negative that somebody else said, which I also had a problem with, when somebody would give me a criticism, even if they didn't mean it in a personal way, I would hold on to that. Cognitive behavioral therapy is really about finding, okay, why does my brain do that? Why did I establish the pattern of jumping to this conclusion? And then once we've established the root of it, the root of where that trauma comes from that has established that pathway, that's when, a trained therapist, psychiatrist, psychologist, I don't know which terminology is correct there, they begin to help you deconstruct that pathway and reconstruct a new one that has a much healthier response. And again, I think one thing that a lot of people need to recognize with mental illness is it's always going to be a battle, but it is not something that is ever going to be insurmountable. If you'll go back and listen to, I'm going to shamelessly plug my mom's podcast with her living with lupus and fibro. I would ask her, how are you not the most miserable person? Because you have two different conditions that basically keep you in constant pain. And she said, I choose to wake up every morning and enjoy my day. Even if I've got burning in my shoulders or my legs are so stiff I can barely walk, I still have a day to live. I still have so many things I can do. I still have so many people I can help. And that really resonated with me. And recognizing that even after doing all these different treatment methods, which do work, they provide so much help. There's still days where you're going to have to really push yourself through those moments. And I really want to offer that as encouragement to not be like, oh, I guess the therapy didn't work because I'm still feeling a little depressed, or I'm still having these panic attacks or whatever. you don't have to be discouraged. Just continue to push forward and recognize, exactly as you said too, not just support groups, find a great community of friends. Even if your friends don't have the exact same things that you're going through, just having an outlet to not isolate.
Oh, yes, don't isolate. Chris, I just want to ask you this though, because you obviously have a very clear and healthy self-awareness. You are very aware of what your triggers are. You're very aware of how to practice positive self-talk and recognize those voices that are toxic. And you have a very positive outlook on what is a negative situation, but that you're going to manage it. But Chris, we all know, everyone listening or watching either knows of someone or has heard of someone that they took their life, and almost everyone around them said, we had no idea what happened. And I mean, I know people, and we had no idea. Now, first of all, did you ever get to that point where you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay. I'm. It's the sort of thing that I do kind of want to pivot and say, when people go, we had no idea, from a person who's been at that perspective, that's exactly what you want. You want people to have no idea what you're going through until it is not too late. But it's the sort of thing that's why I talk so much about never isolating yourself in those moments. And people are always like, well, how are you so open about this? How could you talk about the fact that you almost took your own life? What have I got to lose by sharing that? What if there are people out there who can take that information and help me? It's the sort of thing that when people are at the end of their rope like that, and I reach out and say, reach out to this person or reach out to this person, they're like, I don't know if I want to do that. I'm scared. And I say, well, if you're already at this point, what do you have to lose? What do you have to lose by reaching out and sharing what it is that you're going through? And once you share it once and you have it to where the person doesn't respond how you think they are, because in your head, when you say it, when you come out and say, I'm suffering with this, this, and this, I'm feeling like I want to do this, this, and this, your brain with that negative thinking thinks that everybody's going to respond, what's wrong with you? Get over it. Why are you thinking like this? We raised you better, or we're your friends. You think you're going to have this bombastic, explosive response, but almost every single time it's the exact opposite. And that's when you realize, I don't have to hide this anymore. I don't have to keep it isolated, because I would almost consider any mental illness to be parasitic in nature, and the fact that it needs its host to be isolated to be its most potent. In order for your depression or anxiety to really give the kick that it wants to, it needs you to be wrapped up in bed in the dark at, right now we're recording at 2 p.m., wrapped up in your bed, not on your phone, just completely isolated. Because that's when not only do those little repeating thoughts happen more, they get louder, and they get louder and louder and louder until finally they reach a culmination. And so again,
and if you isolate that long, are you saying that if you isolate and there's no one there to counter those voices, and you already feel worthless and you're listening to lies, do you think that's the point at which people who do take their lives, do you think it's at that point when they've isolated so long that they can't even hear any other voice?
Yeah, I think it's, again, I would say in that matter, it's different for every person. Sometimes it's an impulse decision that in retrospective, even the person who did the action could look back, they would go, that was an impulse decision and I shouldn't have done that.
Right.
Yes, it's the sort of thing that they have just been so isolated, or maybe they didn't have a proper structure or support group, in just the sense that they didn't feel like they could reach out. Or there's also, substance abuse. There's so many different factors that go into it. I really can't give like a clear answer, but I definitely would say the isolation plays into it and it exacerbates it. Any of those other factors that contribute to someone doing that, the isolation is a magnifier, and it will just take any of those situations and just put a giant magnifying glass over it. So I've said it multiple times, but I mean, I would just encourage anyone listening that is, going through any sort of mental illness, or just even if you're having a low point. I mean, I feel like a lot of us are having lower points now because of the fact that with COVID, a lot of us have to be isolated. I'm
Yeah.
talking about not being isolated. You're like, okay,
Yeah.
well, what the heck do I do? I have to wear a
Yeah.
mask to even walk out to
Yeah.
my mailbox. So
Yeah.
the beautiful thing about the age that we live in, even if it's not quite the same as in-person contact, exactly what Jamie and I are doing right now, having a conversation over a Zoom meeting in our case, having a digital friend group or a digital conversation, I would say is equally valid to an in-person friend group in a situation like this. Just because we are having a resurgence of COVID or we've gone through COVID doesn't mean you have to go, well, Chris said a lot of great stuff, but I don't want to get sick. And so I guess we'll just put this off until things get better. You can still have really deep, engaging conversations with the people you know, or even meet new ones in support groups online. So,
Oh, yes.
yeah, I think there's so many different options for people to be able to reach out. The main thing is just take faith, trust in yourself, and take that first little small step into revealing a little bit of it. You don't have to tell your whole story. You've probably heard as I'm talking, I could talk to a brick wall for 4 hours on pretty much anything in my life, but you don't have to start out in that place. You can just share what you're comfortable with. Just share a little bit, just a little tidbit of it. And I think you're going to be amazed at how you feel after you share it and the response that you get from those around you when you share it.
You know, that's very good. I mean, I had my friend Dimey on, the women's grief counselor, and she said something that really stuck. If you feel it, you can heal it. If you share it, you can bear it. And I feel like just walking through my situational depression with losing Cam, there were so many times that, like you said, it was so enticing for me to just be home alone and not reach out. No, I just want to sit here in this thought world and scroll through pictures of Cam and me and the better days. And what I realized I was doing, because my pastor wrote a wonderful book, Out of the Cave, right at the time I lost Cam, and he was talking about chewing the cud, rehearsing things over and over. And I was doing that. And I realized, hey, I'm going to allow myself just a little bit of time to scroll through and sit in this dark place. But then I'm getting up and I'm going to go see my friends, go take a walk. So it sounds like you're saying, whether it's a situational depression that you're having to work through or a long-term clinical type depression, that it always pays to connect with others, that
Yes.
it's always going to be helpful, as long as there are people that are not toxic, which I feel like at your age, you probably don't allow any toxic people into your life. I mean, that tends to we tend to outgrow those people. I think that's...
You can still run into them, but I think just in general, you can begin to get a read on someone pretty quickly. And even if they're toxic, I feel like this is where even my own depression is like, oh, but what if you share something with someone who's toxic? Then what do you do? It's the sort of thing that if you're willing to be open about it, you really don't need to worry about sharing something like just the basics with someone that may not be the best for reciprocating it. It's like, okay, what's the worst that they could do with that information? Oh, well, they could tell other people. Well, you're working on telling other people. So, I mean, they might not portray it in the same light, but at the same time, it's, again, you can see how your brain in those types of thoughts will always try to find something to stop you from taking that first step. There's always going to be something of what if? And that's really the biggest roadblock to taking those steps, I feel like. You were talking about how you set a limited amount of time for yourself to, reminisce and go through those old pictures, and then you would get up and do something. In my case, a lot of times I'll say, yeah, I'll do that too. That's a great idea. And then when the timer starts going off, I'm like, well, I mean, I'd probably have a really bad blood sugar. I'd start trying to find stuff with my health. I'll start trying to find anything to not get out of that bed. And so I talked about taking the first step. You don't have to reveal everything, just reveal a little bit. When it comes to physically getting up and doing something, exercise is going to help you immensely. I'm trying to get back into it, but exercise works wonders. Even if it's just walking back and forth to your mailbox, if you don't want to walk any further than that, just do that for 15 minutes. But with the physical aspect of that, with depression and anxiety or any mental illness, just get up and do it. Even if you feel like you got hit by a bus, just get up and do a simple short walk. And I guarantee you'll feel better. Again, that's where I'll refer back to my mother's episode, because that's exactly what she does. When she has a flare up with her fibro or lupus, she gets up and goes for a walk, or she goes to the gym. And she says, I know I'm going to feel better after I finish it. Even if driving to the gym, I feel terrible, I know if I can just push a little bit further for that 30 minutes, I'm going to feel a world better for the rest of the day. So.
Right. Well, Chris, is there anything you would say as we wrap this up to someone who's listening and they think, I'm listening to Chris and it sounds like I may be depressed, because it may not be cut and dried.
Yeah.
What would be your advice to first someone who's not sure if they're depressed or having depression, and then second to someone who is pretty sure? And it might be the same advice to both.
I think the same advice to both would be pretty beneficial. The first thing I would say is just go speak to your general physician, your primary doctor.
Good first step.
Just talk with them, because they will be able to look for more, medical standards of what fits depression, anxiety. They've got a basic questionnaire and type of thing that they'll go through with you. And it's a good first step to, they'll be able to tell, because they've been trained to look out for these things.
Oh, yeah.
Depression and anxiety are far more common than a lot of people think. I think that's the other thing is there's a lot. But the second would be maybe looking around and setting up a initial consultation or initial first visit with a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a therapist, whomever you feel comfortable speaking to, because after you get kind of the general diagnosis from a general physician, going to someone that is trained in more the mental aspect, the mental health side of things, they can really help narrow it down to find out really where you're at in that walk. Because of course, there's so many different conditions that fall under the umbrella of depression. There's so many different conditions that fall under the umbrella of anxiety.
Right.
I think if you approach it with those two steps, that really is going to give you a world of insight. Even if you decide, well, I feel like I'm a little depressed, but I really don't think I need to go to therapy yet. Just having those two initial consultations to get a really definitive diagnosis can be really beneficial to helping you make future decisions as you walk with it.
Well, that is helpful. And as you said, the first step, I do believe, should be your primary physician, because there are conditions that can mimic depression, or like if your thyroid is low, things such as that, or certain physical or psychosomatic issues. But, well, Chris, I just want to thank you, because, I had no idea until this week that you had struggled with mental illness. Never, because you're successful, you're great at what you do, you've got a thriving business, and it sort of took me by surprise. But the fact that you would share this to help others is extremely kind and brave of you. So I thank you. And I know this is going to be beneficial to many.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's the sort of thing that I had so many wonderful people come alongside and help me in my moments that I needed it. I'm honestly trying to be as vocal about it as I can in the appropriate moments, because, I definitely didn't mean to keep you in the dark on it, but it's the sort of thing that unless the conversation fits in, I really don't want to bring it up now. But at the same time, with the amount of help that I got from others, my mindset now is I want to be that person that can provide that help to others, exactly as those people who came before me were able to help me through it, because that's how we get through this, by, sticking together through it. There's so much strength in this community of people that are walking through mental illness right now. You can see it even on a national stage. Like it is so beneficial to have these open conversations and to create that community with these people.
Well, I totally agree. And again, Chris, thank you so much. I am deeply grateful for you, and on many levels. So, and those listening and watching, all of this will be in the show notes. And Chris, you can provide some of the resources that you mentioned where people can reach out, and then any other resources you might recommend. But thank you. And thank you to all who are listening or watching. And you have a fabulous rest of your day. Chris, again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie.